Hello and welcome. My name's TJ Gamble, also known as the eCommerceaholic, and you have tuned in to the eCommerce Happy Hour. We're here just to help you get more from your e-commerce store. And I'm sure by now you've all heard the news that Adobe intends to acquire our beloved Magento. Well, there was a lot of fear in the community on Monday when it was announced, and I did the only logical thing I could do. I went out and found the person that can hopefully help calm some of those fears. And I didn't have to look that hard because this person was already actively engaging with the Magento community on Twitter. And so you may already know this person. It seems to be everyone's favorite person in the Magento community already. It's a title I've been working for, and you get it in less than a week. But I want everyone to welcome Matt Asay, head of Adobe's developer ecosystem, to the show. Welcome, Matt.
TJ, thank you. I have actually felt very, very welcomed by you and by the 315,000 other people in the Magento community. It's been a little bit overwhelming, but in a good way.
So is the Adobe community on Twitter as strong as Magento's, or was that a bit of a surprise?
No. The short answer is no. It's not, but it's a positive thing. One of the things that I love about open source generally, but you know what? I've worked for, depending on when you started, I've been in open source for 20 years, so I've worked for a number of open source companies. I've worked with a number of open source communities, and I assume that you and the Magento folks know this, but and I'm not just blowing smoke or whatever. Magento is different because, like, my last company before joining Adobe was MongoDB, very popular developer-oriented database, and we had what I would consider a really strong community, but it wasn't like Magento. You didn't have a happy hour, a MongoDB happy hour.
You're going to find out, for better or worse, that the Magento community is very, very passionate about this platform and what we do. And that knife definitely cuts both ways sometimes.
Yeah, well, it's like I said, it's been a little bit overwhelming, but in a very good way. I've been out of my mind happy about this.
Great. So 20 years, you mentioned 20 years of open source experience. Now I pulled up your LinkedIn profile. You know, I'm not some big detective here, but there's a lot of interesting things on that LinkedIn profile. VP of Community at Mongo, CEO of Canonical, an Ubuntu company. You worked on the Novell team that moved them towards open source. Emeritus board member of the Open Source Initiative, founder and chair of the Open Source Business Conference, board of advisors on companies like Sugar CRM, and a Juris Doctorate from Stanford with a focus in open source intellectual property licenses. Now, that's a long history. I think that qualifies you as an expert in open source, but most of us in the Magento community don't think of Adobe as an open source company. So why don't you tell us a little bit, maybe a little more about your background that I didn't mention there, and how did that prepare you for the role you're currently in at Adobe?
So I'm trying to think of the right way to back into this. So the interesting thing, when I joined Adobe, I was planning to leave MongoDB. And I loved working at Mongo, but for a variety of reasons, we brought in a new CEO who's turned out to be fantastic, but introduced a lot of change. I was looking for a place to go, and I reached out to someone that I knew for years ago, and he and I competed for different open source companies. He worked for Day Software, which became Adobe Experience Manager, and I worked for Alfresco, an open source content management company. And we went out to breakfast, and David said, and I was just trying to get his opinion on different options. And he said, well, you should come work here. And one thing that should be interesting, I'll stop there briefly, because one thing that he said, and I said, I'm not interested in working for Adobe. I don't want to work for a big company. And I don't even know how to use Photoshop. I use GIMP. So the and he said, well, what's interesting is, he said, Adobe's not a startup, and I'm not going to try to pretend that it is, but it's telling that all of the executive teams and most of the employees that have come in through acquisition have stayed. So for those worried about some continuity in the Magento world, I mean, obviously I can't guarantee that everyone's going to want to stay with Adobe for the rest of their lives, but the track record of Adobe retaining those people, both executives and engineers and others, is pretty good. So he said that, and I thought, well, if all these startup folks could want to work at Adobe and stay there, maybe it wouldn't be that bad. So I did a round of interviews with Brad Rencher, who runs the Experience Cloud business where Magento will sit, and loved him, loved the other people that I met with. Said, okay, I wanted to go work for another open source startup, but I'll go to Adobe instead. And my role at that time, Brad asked, there are a range of different things you could do, Matt. We need help with everything from PR to we need help figuring out mobile. We need help figuring out this and that. And I said, well, what do you need most? At that time, he said mobile. So I did that because I have some mobile background. Some of the open source startups that I was with were on the mobile side. So that's how I ended up here. And then just last year, David Nuschler, that guy who originally convinced me to come, said, actually, I need some help working with our developer community. And I'll tell you honestly, my initial response was, we don't do anything with developers. I have no interest in this. And he said, well, actually, I think you'd be surprised at the level of interest we have in getting this right. We're building out what we call the Adobe Cloud Platform, and a platform doesn't make any sense if there aren't developers. And when I say developers, I do mean an individual developer sitting in her garage, but also the developers that work for system integrators, that work for software vendors, etc. And it took him 6 months to convince me, but here I am. I took the job, and what I've been surprised at, to that question that you posed about Adobe's. I'm trying to remember if you asked specifically about open source or developers, and maybe I'll tackle both. Because I think it's hard to talk about developers these days without talking about open source. It is the currency that developers speak. And even Amazon, which arguably is the best, AWS is the best developer success story of any company. And they did it arguably without a lot of open source in their in how they go to market. But even that's changing as they've come under a lot of pressure from Microsoft and from Google and others, where it's not sufficient anymore to just have a good API. You also have to have developers want to see the code. They want to fiddle with things. And even when they don't want to fiddle with things, even when they don't want to submit that pull request, they want to know that they can, that it's an option, even if they choose not to exercise it. So it's hard to talk about developers without talking about open source. So long story short, Adobe has not always been very public about what it does with developers. And I mean, if you can watch, we have this up and down relationship with developers over the years, where like early on with say Cold Fusion or even, dare I say, with Flash, which I know is kind of a 4-letter word now, there was a time where that made Adobe actually really popular with developers. Now it makes us the opposite with developers. And I have my Flash control running in my browser so that I don't ever have to see Flash. So I mean, I understand that part, but behind the scenes, especially with Apache, starting with Day Software, with David Nuschler's company, they've been active contributors to a variety of Apache projects. for the last 10 years, and that's become part of Adobe's heritage. And so somebody had asked a question on Twitter today about, how many, how does Adobe deal with committers and maintainers? How many external committers does it have to its projects? And I'll regurgitate my response here, which was that, and this isn't universally true, but a big focus for us is actually working through community. So when in that question, they said their projects, like Adobe projects. And since a lot of the work we've done is through Apache, we wouldn't even say our projects. Is Apache Jackrabbit or Fling or Spark, are those Adobe projects? No. But in some of those cases, or Cordova, we are a strong and often the dominant contributor on those projects, but they're not ours per se. They're the communities. In this case, they're the Apache Software Foundations. There are other projects like Hubble where where they're not Apache projects. We are the dominant contributor to those projects, but we actively encourage and are seeking those external committers, and in the case of Hubble, are, I think, doing a good job of getting to that point. So it kind of depends on the project. We don't have a corporate mandate where we have to be the only kid on the playground in the open source. In fact, we have the opposite. We want external parties to work with us. So maybe I'll stop there, but I'll stop there with just the brief summary of it would be foolish for me to say that we have the same open source pedigree as, say, a Magento. I mean, Magento has, since Roy and team started in the first, has been open source from day one. And I'll raise my hand and say I actually helped to advise Roy on how to grow the Magento more on the business side. But so if anyone wants to shake their fist at Roy for how he's done it or how he did it early on, you can point the finger at me as well, because we had conversations way back when about how to do that right.
Just don't take credit for the eBay days. As long as you don't do that, I think we'll be fine here. And I think that's a great introduction. Just to let everyone know, we've only got a limited time. We've got some questions already queued up from social media, but please go ahead, submit your questions, subscribe to the channel, hit thumbs up on the video. All of that really helps the channel. A lot of things that have been asked, I'm sure we'll not be able to get answers to. We can't speculate on certain things. There's, because the deal is still in the works, a lot of things around Adobe's plans for Magento can't necessarily be touched on, but I'll ask them anyway. It's not my job to turn down the questions. So we'll go through some of the questions I've got here and keep posting them in the comments, and we will attempt to get to everything we can possibly get to today. So I got a question from Bartek on Twitter asking, most people know Adobe as a company that has a great suite of products for creative. So instantly when people think Adobe, they think of the Creative Suite and Photoshop and those things.
Right.
What biggest initiatives does Adobe have on the technical side of web development? Do they, obviously you've got Dreamweaver from back in the day people build websites on, but outside of the Creative Suite, what is Adobe doing on the technical side of things?
Yeah, and I saw that question, and unfortunately, I saw it about 5 minutes before we went on the air, and so I don't have a good answer for that. There is a good answer, and if you said is Bartek,
yeah, and of course I'll get you these. I mean, you've got access to the questions. So we can always address them on Twitter later on.
So that's one that I think I'd prefer to address on Twitter. The one thing that I would say is, even though, so it is absolutely true when you think of Adobe, you think of Photoshop, you think of Illustrator and things like that. And that is absolutely what my family thought when I joined the company. A short anecdote: when I started, like a day in my first or second day at Adobe, I got a brother was in a meeting. I sent it through to voicemail. He started texting me. I finally went out and called him. I said, Chad, what's up? I thought one of his kids had died. And he said, okay, so I can't get this PDF to open. Now that you work there, can you give me some technical support? And the answer is no. I didn't know anything about it then. I don't know anything about it now. But I just suggested that he shut down Acrobat and then reboot his machine, and lo and behold, it worked. So that is how people tend to think of Adobe. But keep in mind that at least a third of our business is web analytics. It's web content management. That's the experience manager. It's personalization, all of it web focused. And so I'm going to answer that question. I ask you to help remind me to do this. I'll answer that question over Twitter when I get some people that can point to some of the projects that we're working on in particular. But I would say, I would suggest that people take a look at Brackets as an open source project, and Hubble. And Hubble is the one that is particularly cool, I think, right now. I will, like I said, if you'll remind me, I'll get to that one over Twitter. But there is a good answer, because most of our business, all of the Experience Cloud side of the business that Magento fits into is web. And so so there are actually some really cool things that we're working on there. But I want to give that question was more detailed than I'm able to give off the cuff. So I want to make sure I give a good answer to it.
Sure. And we've got one Adobe person actively involved in the chat here. The Adobe IO account has posted that more info about Adobe's open source work can be found on the Adobe IO website. I will update the description of this video after this live stream ends to link to that website.
Okay.
All right. So moving on to Bartek's second question, and I know this is going to be a tough one to answer, but what changes should the community expect on the agency development level? Is this acquisition going to change how we work? And I'm gonna add a little bit to that, in that I'm assuming you can't speculate on that, but maybe you have some insight as to how Adobe's current partner program works for things like Experience Manager, that at least gives us some insight as to what might happen.
No, so it's absolutely the case that I can't comment directly on that question. But both on so think about that. Adobe Experience Manager has a similar model in that it's system integrators that actively tweak it, extend it, et cetera, that do the deployments. And so we're very comfortable working through partners on that. Speaking honestly, not all of our businesses. Some of our businesses we go direct and we pretty much do the services ourselves. But Experience Manager, which is our largest business in the Experience Cloud, is absolutely partner driven and will remain such. And we have Adobe Exchange, that is kind of a marketplace for our partners to work with us. And I'll be honest, very honest, what Magento does with its marketplace is ahead of what we're doing. So we actually want to learn from that. And maybe that's where I'd end on that question. It would be comforting, I'm sure, for some to think that this is not in the Magento community, but in the Adobe analyst community or whomever, that Adobe acquires Magento and all of the value flows from Adobe to Magento. We teach Magento how to do business, blah, blah, blah. That's not why this deal got done. There's a reason that we bought Magento and not somebody else. And I know there was speculation about our interest in other companies, but there's a reason that we spent roughly $1.7 billion on Magento. We have a lot of money. We could have bought somebody else, but it's precisely the community that makes Magento so interesting to us, and I think to your customers, to your partners. I mean, you got 315,000 developers in and around the Magento constellation. And those are for me, as on the head of developer ecosystem at Adobe, I look at that and I'm in awe, and I'm thinking both, here's some things that we can do to help with Magento, but also, holy cow, look at all the great things that we can get from this community and by working with them. So to that question, can we expect it to continue? I would say, just using common sense, we didn't acquire Magento, the company, so that we could kill the thing that makes that company so amazing, and that is community. And frankly, that's open source. And so, like, while I can't say on December 1st, 2019, we're going to do X, Y, or Z with Magento, both because frankly we don't know, and because I wouldn't be able to comment on it anyway. Just think through how much money was spent, and universally geniuses. I'm certainly not, but you don't spend money like that to and then go out and kill the thing that makes it worth that much money. It's the community.
So you had mentioned that Adobe has some things to learn from Magento, and you specifically mentioned the marketplace. Do you have some more examples of things that you see Magento's doing right that perhaps you want to kind of explore and learn more about?
Yeah, well, so we've been very public over the last 2 years. In particular, just a few months ago at Adobe Summit, that we're in the process of building, and it's now ready for, in a kind of a beta format for some of our partners to use, this Adobe Cloud Platform. Data services built on data services and content services, so that a company like, I'm probably not allowed to mention companies. I'm not saying these are customers. I'm just trying to randomly think of somebody.
Just throw it out there. It's okay. Nobody's watching anyway.
Well, let's look at who's that. What's that brand of alcohol sitting on your desk?
This is Basil Hayden. This is a Jim Beam product, small batch
Basil
Kentucky
Hayden.
bourbon. Yeah,
we're just going to use Basil Hayden. So Basil Hayden wants to interact better with its customers, but it has data sitting all over the place, and it needs to bring it all together into one place and make it useful. This is kind of the idea of the cloud platform, that we can take those assets, the Basil Hayden images, etc., and coupled with what it knows about you, and then personalize an experience consistent with privacy, etc. So we're building this platform, but a platform is only as good as the developers building on it. And do I think that we have a lot to learn from a company like Magento, and really a community like Magento, about how to do that well? Absolutely. So I look at the things that we're doing, and we're working with, we have a range of, you can go on our site, system integration partners that we work with in building out the Adobe Cloud Platform. But I want every one of those 315,000 people thinking about the Adobe Cloud Platform as it pertains to commerce, because you're not going to suddenly wake up and say, I really care a lot about analytics or some other part of the Adobe stack. It's not really a matter of, in fact, it's not at all a matter of co-opting what Magento has done and bring it in and whitewash it and make it Adobe branded at all. It's more a matter of taking the energy, I guess I would say, and the mechanics of how Magento has worked with its community for so long, and bringing that sort of same energy and thinking into how we do business. So, I mean, people will criticize and say, hey, you guys don't really have much of a mid-market, you guys have gone after the big enterprises. And Magento itself has increasingly done business. I think it's over 100 large enterprises that it currently works with. But also keep in mind, we, on the creative side of the business, we're very comfortable working with small to medium-sized enterprises and individuals, and need to learn how to do that better on the Experience Cloud side of our business. So we have things to learn all over, but if I had to boil it down to one thing, it's that energy. Like, there there's no, and it's not just an Adobe thing. There are, like, go to Salesforce, go to Google, go to Amazon. You don't get the same level of excitement and passion with any community that I've seen. Again, I've MongoDB most recently, amazing community, but not like Magento. Not this irreverent and excited, and I think it's good for Adobe. It'll be good for us. That's the sort of thing that I want us to learn from it.
So did you make it out to Imagine a couple of weeks ago?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so you haven't seen the energy firsthand.
Oh, no, I not yet. I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to Germany in a few weeks to get my first taste.
Great. So you're going to be at, is it Meet Magento Germany, or what's the event?
Yeah, that's a Meet Magento, and then and I still don't have all the names down, but then somebody just told me there's an event, a Magento sponsored event, I think in this case, in Barcelona in October, and I plan to go to that. So
there's a lot of them. You've got, I mean, Meet Magento New York's coming up later this year, I believe. I'll have to check the dates on that, but I believe it's October as well. I know we'll be in the Netherlands next week for Meet Magento Netherlands. They're happening at just about every week. Meet Magento UK is coming up in, I think, on the 5th. Yeah, somewhere around mid-June. So you know more about it than I do. See, look, you're already in there.
That's because I've been inundated by requests to participate in these things, and that's what I think is so great. And again, the amazing thing is, so like Meet Magento is not run by Magento; it's run by the community. That's amazing. Like there aren't very many. Again, I've been involved with open source for a long time, and I'm not familiar with any other open source community that operates like that. It's amazing.
Yeah. And just to go ahead and throw a plug in there for Mage Titans as well, which is another series of Magento community-driven events.
And I am sure I will I hope that I shouldn't be that presumptuous. I hope I get an invite to.
There'll be one later this year for sure in Austin. There's a lot more of them overseas. I'm not sure. I'm sure someone will mention in the chat when those are, but there's a lot of them. They're a lot like Meet Magentos. They're usually a little more developer focused in their content, but also just a great series of events. So I'm gonna try to keep on the questions. I know we don't have a ton of time, and this one right here, I'm sure we're just not even really. I know the answer. But again, I'm here to ask. So many Adobe products are subscription-based or cloud-only. Should we expect Adobe to take Magento's pricing model in that direction? And I'm assuming, again, I have to make assumptions on these questions, but I'm assuming they're talking about, if you're talking about the enterprise version, well, it's already really kind of a subscription model anyway. Yeah. I don't know if they're particularly talking about the open source version, but I'll throw it to you if there's anything you want to touch on with that question.
Yeah, and there's not. That is something where I can't really comment at all, other than again to say the intent is to take the great things about Magento and leave them as they are, or make them a little better if we're able. But like you said, Magento, I would have already thought of Magento as a subscription business. So I'm not sure if that question is more to make it more of a SaaS offering. I don't know, but it's not something that I can really comment on. Sorry.
Sure. And I think we've touched on this a little bit, especially, seeing that you have a background in open source, and Adobe obviously has a much bigger history in open source than we realized upon the initial announcement. But how does Magento's open source version fit into Adobe's overall strategy with this acquisition?
Well, again, so I can't comment on specifics of like plans. Other than, again, to say we probably knew that it was open source before we made the decision to buy it. So that's not a surprise to anybody at Adobe. Again, just kind of connecting the dots. If I'm in your shoes, open source is the heart. I describe it as the currency that developers speak, and often cloud is the hardware currency that a developer will speak, but the software currency is open source. And we want that developer energy. We want all those extensions and other contributions that Magento developers make. We want to learn from it, and we want it to continue. So I think I said probably shouldn't have even have said this. I think I said on Twitter, does 10,000 years count as a long-term commitment to open source or something to that effect? And maybe I'll just regurgitate that here, that again, open source was not a surprise. Open source is actually a really good part of this deal. So I should shut up, because I'm sure that the PR folks are watching this someplace and say, Matt, don't say anything more. You're not allowed to say anything, not because there's anything to hide, but just because we're not allowed to say anything.
I understand, but it appears as though your expectation is that Adobe will continue to drive and support the open source, freely available version of Magento.
Yeah, honestly, that's my expectation. And I sure as heck hope so, because I've been like a kid in a candy store as an open source guy. We have stuff going on. We have more and more. We've just recently made all these changes internally to allow our employees, I shouldn't say allow, to make it easier for our employees to contribute to a variety of open source projects, or kick off their own, or to open source their internal products, make them open source. So we've had all this activity going. Heck, the guy who runs engineering for the Experience Cloud, Bill Staples, his last job, or actually not his last job, but before he came from Microsoft, where he was one of the key guys at open source.net. So that open source, and Bill has been amazing for engineering culture, and kind of helping to ensure that we have this open collaborative development model. So like if I'm sitting at Magento, like if I'm an employee, I'm an engineer there, I'd feel really comfortable knowing that Bill is the one running engineering over here. And again, it's that open source model that makes the Magento business work. You don't pay 1.7 billion, or roughly 1.7 billion, and then squash that. That would be stupid.
Absolutely. All right, next question from Kathy Swanson. And I believe an integration already exists. I think this was announced a couple of years ago, but what do you envision the relationship and roadmap looking like between Magento and Adobe's Experience Manager?
And that's another one that's something that'll have to wait until we actually close the deal. But I can say this, that we got a lot of people on the Experience Manager side who are kind of excited about this addition of commerce to what they're doing. So I would say closer, tighter, but beyond that, I can't really comment right now.
I understand. All right, next question from Eric. Adobe has been Java focused. Magento's obviously PHP. What other open source projects does Adobe have or support that are currently PHP? This appears to be a whole new community, PHP. And do you see any issues or differences between this and your Java projects?
So yeah, this is another one that I saw the question right before we went on the air. I'm not familiar. I'm trying to think of what Hubble and brackets are written in. There is all of the AEM stuff, all of the Apache stuff is in Java, but there isn't any preference. I mean, I've never heard anybody articulate a preference for that. And given that so much of our other stuff is web on the Omniture, the former Omniture, I don't know. I saw some comment on Twitter, somebody saying, and it wasn't an Adobe employee, but it was somebody basically denigrating PHP, saying, if it's not Java, it's not real. And that just seems like such a dumb statement.
those condescending Java folks, man. You just can't. Sometimes you just can't hang out with those people.
I would say, well, unfortunately, you got to hang out with a few of them, but hopefully not condescending. I would say go on Adobe IO, to that comment that was made earlier, and check out some of the projects. I've never heard any, like, until I assume we have PHP. I assume we have stuff written in Go. I assume we have all sorts of languages. There's no requirement that stuff be written in Java. That'd be kind of boring. But I don't know of any, like, off the top of my head. But aside from the Apache projects, I also can't. I don't know what Hubble's written in. So I know these projects, but I don't really think of them in terms of the language they're written in. So, I can say again, just like we knew that Magento was open source before we acquired it, we also knew about PHP, and to me, it's a non-issue. Like, it's an amazing product that a lot of big and small companies use, and this weirdness that to be a real application, you have to be written in Java or C++ or something like that I think it's stupid. So, but I would take a look at Adobe IO, and you can get pointers to other open source projects here to see what they're written in.
All right, next question, and this one's going to be another interesting answer here, I'm sure. Adobe is moving everything to Azure. I'm always terrible with pronouncing things. You just read them, and then you don't hear people say them, and then you butcher it when you got to say it on a live stream. Sorry about that. But Magento Cloud has always been 100% AWS focused. Do you envision the possibility of Magento Cloud moving that way, or continuing down the AWS path it's on?
Yeah, and that would be another one that I can't answer. Other than I could say this, that even nothing moves quickly. Even like we do have that commitment to Azure, and I've also heard it pronounced different ways. So I'm going to say Azure, but I might be pronouncing it incorrectly. We do have that commitment, but you can also, it's not hard to go in and check. We still have a lot of stuff running on AWS, and it'll be that way for a while, because you can't flip the switch and move stuff over. So I can't comment on what the plans are for it, but even if the plan was to move to Azure, that wouldn't happen tomorrow. It wouldn't happen next year. Just stuff doesn't move that fast. So that's something that I'm sure will be part of once the deal closes, because this person who asked the question won't be the only one with that question. I'm sure it'll be addressed at that time.
Okay, I've got some great quotes from articles that you have written. This was easy to get content. Well, I mean, I say easy. I had to read like 8,000 articles because apparently you've been writing them since the beginning of the internet. But I'm going to pause there and start taking some questions from the actual chat. So keep posting your questions. I've got a few queued up here. And let's see, I think we've already got a few of these taken care of. But Brian asked about Magento U and learning resources, and I'll phrase that into a question. But Magento has Magento U, which are their training resources and tutorials and things about getting certified. So how does Adobe handle that? Do you envision doing that differently? Do you do it differently now? How do you handle training and learning?
So we this is not an area that I'm super familiar with. So I don't know what we have in terms of if there's an Adobe U. I can't comment again on what we would plan to do with moving the Magento stuff into what the equivalent at Adobe. I'm sure, especially on the creative side, that we have. Actually, I just used this the other day. We actually have really good assets on in-app tutorials and whatnot, but I don't know what the future of that would be. I mean, both because I can't comment on it and because I just generally don't know. But again, my sense would be that we would always take the best of both worlds, or the best of whichever world. And so if Magento has done a particularly good job with my head of developer ecosystem hat on, in terms of any developer-oriented training, I would love to have, just like some of the events that you guys do. My initial thought is, man, I'd love to borrow some of the energy that they have rather than reinventing the wheel and doing our own. So to the extent that we have a university, and again, I apologize, I could have done some homework beforehand. Hit me up on Twitter and ask that question again, and I'll get an answer. I can't answer what exactly we'll do with Magento U and stuff like that until the deal closes, but I can have a better answer in terms of what Adobe offers and answer that way.
Ben Roby asks, can you give us some insight into how much preparation you did prior to the announcement to get ready to dive into the Magento community, or is it just been reactive? Like, did you just get attacked by Magento folks and you're like, damn, I need to respond? Or did you go in intentionally engaging the community?
Oh, me personally?
Yeah.
So when you do a deal like this, there's a pretty small group of people that are involved, and that as you get closer to the deal, that circle gets a little bit wider. So I didn't have a lot of lead time. I had some, but not a ton. But when I went on Twitter, I just went on because that's who I am. And was there a lot of advanced preparation? No. I just went on super excited that this had, again, as an open source guy, to like have this amazing open source community, suddenly I get to work with it. So I just went on Twitter, like kind of to like tweet my article and see what was going on. And then the rest was just purely reacting to whatever people were saying in the moment and trying to be as honest as, I shouldn't say as honest, I was 100% honest, as candid as I could be because like on this chat, there's some questions I just can't answer because the deal hasn't closed. But no, not a lot of advanced preparation, just a lot of excitement. For days beforehand, I was trying to like contain my excitement with my team. They couldn't know about it. And they just saw that I was really happy and had to kind of wonder what it was. And I would maybe make a quote or a comment to the guy on our team we do an analysis every month of how many open source contributors we have on, or how many GitHub, how many employees are active on GitHub contributing to open source projects. And I said, well, why don't we run that number again, like after Tuesday of next week, knowing that we could arguably run it with the Magento employees counted in that metric. But I was just excited. So no, there wasn't a lot of planning. I didn't have any canned responses to give anybody. It was all just me commenting in the moment.
So you had mentioned, the deal obviously not being closed. Brian in chat asked, is there a timeline for the deal closing? I think there was something in the announcement, but do you know what that timeline is?
I'm trying to remember what they said. I think it was like 3 to 4 weeks from when it was originally announced.
So soon.
So what does that put us at? Yeah, soonish.
Yeah. Tomorrow, probably, very, very, very quickly. Probably. It's going to happen. It's going to happen quickly. So Alex Schreck there in the chat asked a question about the community partner program, and I'm going to reword his question a little bit because I think it pertains to several comments and questions that I've had. In that, a lot of the people, a lot of the community are just speculating. I don't know if there's any real worry, but speculating about a lot of the changes that Magento made recently. and whether those had anything to do with the pending announcement and acquisition. And the community partner program being one of those, because things like Meet Magento have been organized by the community, sponsored by the community, and now Magento is giving a little more formal organization around that. And so was that something that was done with the knowledge of this happening? Is that something to align it with what Adobe's already doing, perhaps with community organization, or is that just something that was coincidental?
So I certainly can't speak for Magento on this. Maybe, I mean, I have no idea if they made changes based on, they certainly would not have made any changes based on input from Adobe. Because I mean, you never know if a deal is actually going to close, so it'd be unwise of them to make any changes based on the possibility of a deal closing, or even that a deal being made. So I don't think in any way it had to do with Adobe. And actually,
Okay.
and for that matter, I'm not even familiar with what changes were made.
It was a bit of a, I don't know if they've, at least I am not privy to the details, but they announced it. Really was one of the few surprises for me at the Imagine conference was the Magento Association. And I know they've had a lot of meetings with the leaders that are organizing events like Meet Magento and Mage Titans, and they're really fleshing out what that looks like. I don't have the details of that, but it's really just putting more organization and resources behind the community-driven events.
Yeah. If people think it's universally positive, then I'll say, sure, let's take credit. If people are complaining, then I'll say, no, it didn't have anything to do with it. But either way, honestly, we didn't have anything to do with it.
I've definitely heard zero complaints about anything. Magento over the last year has made a lot of progress towards involving and harnessing the power of their community, from accepting pull requests to you've got the community engineering team and the newly formed Magento Association. They've done a great job of continuing to improve the community involvement. The Magento Masters program continues to tick along. It's been going for a few years now to really entice people to give back more. So they seem to be doing a lot of the right things to harness their competitive advantage, which is the community.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
All right, so we're going to continue going down the questions. Keep posting your questions. I'm getting to the bottom of my list here, and I'll go through the chat, make sure we didn't miss any. But if I haven't addressed your question, please feel free to repost it. All right, we've got a question from let's see, M2E. Let me read this question here. And again, I think this is probably one of those that you probably can't touch on, but would love to have a clear strategy on what's next. We service close to 10,000 Magento M1 merchants. This has got to be some sort of technology partner, and the huge number of them still have not considered if they would move to M2. First of all, I'm going to touch on that for a second. If some of them need help moving to M2, give me a call. You know where to find me. I'm not difficult to find. I don't know if I could help 10,000 of them, but 10, 20 maybe. But everybody wants to know kind of what the future holds. Obviously there's been a lot of speculation around Magento 1, and Magento announced kind of an end of life of Magento 1 and then backtracked on that a little bit based on pushback from merchants and the community. And it seems to be a bit of an open-ended kind of thing now. It's going to end, but we're not 100% sure when it's going to end. I don't know if you can really touch on it, or if there's something in general we could talk about, as far as is there something similar that Adobe has acquired that kind of has an older version that, I don't know. Is there anything on there that you could touch on to provide some value?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I ever provide much value, but unfortunately on that question, that's the exact sort of question I just can't answer. And I totally understand the concern there. And has Adobe ever end of life projects or products? Yes. And you, I mean, like any company, any responsible company, you do that with deliberation and with proper concern for customers and partners. But in this case, no, I can't comment on it. But that's a good thing to ask in 3 to 4 weeks when the deal closes.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, hopefully, I guess the question is, we'll go ahead and put you on the spot here. Maybe can you come back after the deal closes and be a little more candid about some of these questions?
So I could come back, but I think for some of those questions, what I would recommend for those types of questions, there'll be somebody better than me to answer those questions. But should there be somebody from Adobe answering those sorts of questions? Absolutely. And somebody senior that can stand behind the answer? Absolutely.
We'll take that discussion offline.
Okay.
I'll hit you up about that afterward.
Yeah, I can help you with that.
Ryan asked, will Adobe be putting more resources into Magento Core, such as more core engineers?
So I'm trying to think of, so the short answer is I don't know. But what I can, and it's probably another one I can't comment on, other than historically, the answer has been yes. For other products or companies that we've acquired. So historically, that answer has been yes. I don't know if that means that it'll apply to Magento, but historically, the answer has been yes.
Great.
And I can tell you this as well. There have been a number of engineers not formally affiliated with, I mean, they're not going to be on the Magento team. They're like either in our developer working with Adobe I/O, which is where we house a lot of the APIs and whatnot for the company. But I've had a number of people coming out of the woodwork already doing integrations with Magento, like actively kicking the tires on the repo. I don't know if any of them have submitted pull requests yet, but so even informal additions to the Magento engineering community, I think you'll see that from Adobe because there's a lot of excitement and interest in wanting to get involved. So again, that's not an official answer. I don't know what the official answer will be. I'm sure even in 3 to 4 weeks, I would guess if you ask that question, they won't be able to answer it definitively, in part because they may not know at that point what exactly is needed in the Magento product or the code and whether we have the people that would be able to do it. But historically, the answer has been yes.
And another question here from the chat. Will Adobe increase the developer relations efforts for Magento incorporating into their own program, or are they content with letting Ben Marks try to set a world record for Delta SkyMiles?
So is that I've talked with Ben, and we did actually talk about his travel fetish. I didn't realize that he was a Delta guy, so that's or maybe that's just they're supposing. I don't know how it'll work in terms of where people will report in the organization yet, speaking very candidly. But I would love to have Ben on my team. So if anybody from Adobe is listening in, I would love to have Ben on my team and minimize his travel impact somewhat. I don't know the answer to that, but we do have a strong and growing developer advocate. I think he calls himself an evangelist. We've chosen to call our team the developer advocacy team. And we do have a strong and growing team there that Ben would be an amazing part of. And I think I think there are things that I know there are things that we can learn from Magento in terms of developer advocacy and evangelism. But to the point made by that question, could you use a little bit of help just in terms of bodies, more people? Answer is yes. And all of my team, everyone on my team, will be skilling up on Magento. So you have at least that commitment from me, even if it's not a pan Adobe corporate-wide response. In terms of just the developer ecosystem, Magento is like now the crown, is like the jewel in the crown. So am I going to feed that? Am I personally going to feed that? The answer is yes.
Quick jump to the bottom of the questions here. Philip Jackson asks, how many advocates are currently employed by Adobe, and how many and how are they apportioned amongst your various products?
So it depends on how I define that. My team is not the only. We are the only pan Adobe team, but there are pockets of individuals with the Creative Suite and elsewhere. My team is about 40 people, but we have pockets throughout the company that I honestly don't know the total number, but in terms of what I would consider developer advocate, or closely related to that, maybe 10 to 20, depending on how you define it. And are we going to be growing that team? Yes, we've been growing that team consistently over the last year. But there was a second part of that question that I've forgotten it, didn't I?
Well, kind of how are they spread out amongst your products, or is it like you're an Adobe advocate, or like would you be a Magento specific advocate? How would that work?
We have both. We have people who cover a range of products, and then we have people that go very deep on individual products. And so we would have both that would be supporting Magento.
And Ryan here asks a question that kind of touches back on adding more resources to the Magento core team. Would Adobe bring their internal development practices, processes, management into the fold? Are you looking to change and or improve kind of how Magento does their development?
I would guess, and this is not an official cast in stone, but I would say we're going to take the best from either world. There are definitely things that we can learn from Magento in terms of how to do community development right. And then this is not me giving away secrets, but Adobe's a company that's been doing software development for a long time and has done some things really well over the years and builds good product. And so I think there'll be a little bit of sharing back and forth. I wouldn't expect the Magento development process to dramatically change, and I wouldn't expect the Adobe development process to dramatically change overnight, but the hope is that those two will bleed into each other. And I mentioned Bill Staples before, who has this strong open source background from Microsoft, and I've seen the changes that he has made within his organization, and again, that's Experience Cloud where Magento sits. And I think I'd see Magento helping to come in and accelerate some of the changes that he was making. And to that question, are there things that the Magento engineering can learn or will learn from Adobe? I'm sure there are. I don't know what those are, but I'm sure it will be a back and forth. It's not the conqueror coming in and saying assimilate now or die. I suspect there may actually be more learning from Magento in terms of that open development model, because again, we're serious about this platform aspiration, and so there's stuff that we need to learn there, and the Magento will help us to learn more quickly than we would on our own, I think.
All right, so if I mention Magento Go, are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
I'm not.
Okay, Magento tried for a while. It's been years ago now, and I've forgotten exactly when, but they tried very hard to do basically a SaaS model using the Magento platform, and it turned out to be a moderate disaster. It lost all the great things about Magento and its flexibility, and it was just not an overly great situation. So I've got a question here about it, but I'm going to phrase it a little differently than M2E Pro asked the question, and I'm going to go to my notes here, and I have an article that you wrote in 2012, and I posted it in the Google Docs I shared with you so you could look at it. But basically, there's a few excerpts from this article that are particularly interesting, especially in context around this acquisition. And you talk about the article is comparing cloud software to open source. And you go through talking about how people don't really want to be bothered with the inner workings of their software. And by people, I mean, organizations, merchants in this case, don't really want to be bothered by the inner workings. And many people view, and you say many of us, which includes you, view cloud as the natural heir to open source rather than a real competitor. And many of the arguments used to favor open source adoption, such as try before you buy and getting work done without involving IT, are more true of cloud computing than they ever were of open source. And your closing paragraphs here talk about how cloud is more user friendly, and open source has been great for developers and vendors. And your closing paragraph, open source, in other words, remains a hugely important aspect of software development and will be so for years to come. But while it's relevant to IT buyers, it's not their first consideration in choosing a product, nor should it be. To the extent that they build their own applications internally, most will heavily embrace open source. But when enterprises are looking for a vendor to help solve a business problem through software, they largely don't care whether open source is listed as an ingredient on the can. And how I'm going to relate that to Magento Go is how I'm taking, or how I interpret you using the word cloud here is almost SaaS like.
Sure.
And so, do you see the potential for Adobe to try to reboot some sort of Magento based SaaS product? And it may be in addition to the open source offerings, but do you see that as a potential, and what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So I can't comment directly on that question, but what I can say is that, first of all, there's no shortage of dirt that if anybody wants to go back and into all the stuff that I've written over the years, heaven help me if I ever run for public office. The cloud and open source has had an uneven truce that seems to be getting better over the last few years. And what I mean by that is, I do think that in general, if I'm Basil Hayden, I just want something that works. Now, I may not fully appreciate that the reason that something just works is because of the open source community behind it. Speaking of Magento, so they may say, "I just want a commerce. I just want a shopping cart. I just want to be able to sell stuff over my on my website." And it needs to be. But then you ask them, "Well, do you care about, like, I don't know, the X, Y, and Z features?" And suddenly those features come from the community, or do you want to have choice in here? And suddenly the open source aspect of it starts to matter, even if they're not thinking about it as, I want an open source commerce product. So just kind of, I guess maybe I'm hedging a little bit on that article. Open source often matters even when people don't think that it matters. Maybe that's what I mean. On the cloud side, or SaaS, so I don't know what Adobe will do on that. We're doing some of that with our own products. Campaign, email management, and AEM are both two where we've been working to SaaSify them, if you will. And as you know from the Magento Go, it's a non-trivial thing. In the case of Magento, it'd be non-trivial because you're also, like, you risk losing some of that goodness that you get from the very thing that I was talking about before, that community goodness that feeds Magento. and that's been a struggle from day one on with open source. I remember with Sugar CRM, one of their early selling points is you can use us on-prem, you can use us in a managed, in kind of a managed service sort of manner, or you can just go off and use the full SaaS version of it. And it was never clear to me exactly in that SaaS world how the open source code fed into that, and honestly, it's still not 100% clear to me. So that's a long way of saying I don't know. Like, I don't know what the right answer is for Magento. Like, forget Adobe in this. I don't know what the right answer for Magento would be. I suspect that a lot of Magento customers would love just a SaaS offering that's super easy to use. But would they love it as much if using Magento that way cut them off from a lot of the things that make Magento great? Maybe so. I don't know. Like, it's a hard thing, and maybe that's where I'd end on that question. Is it's a hard thing. It's not going to be any easier. You don't just add Adobe and suddenly it makes it super easy to answer that question and to get it right. So if it was hard for Magento to figure it out, it's going to be hard for Adobe to figure it out. There's some things that we know from our Creative Cloud side and from the work that we've done on Experience Cloud that I think may prove helpful, but I wouldn't look for immediate changes or anything like that, because it's a hard problem to solve, whether you're Magento or anyone else.
Probably one of the most asked questions I've gotten thus far is, what's the chance of getting a Creative Cloud license?
If you're a Magento employee, it's very easy because you'll get it for free once you join. And by the way, if you have friends who are Magento employees, once they're Adobe employees, there are significant discounts that they can give to friends and family. And so cozy up with Ben Marks. Everybody's going to be cozying up to Ben to get those discounts. I don't know what we do for partners. I just don't know. We must have some sort of a discount. It's probably not as aggressive a discount as free. Well, I know it's not as aggressive as free, and it's not as good a discount as friends and family get. But I can find that out because I can go on our internal portal and figure that out really quickly if you'll just remind me.
Absolutely, I will hit you because I'm curious.
There won't be free Creative Cloud for everyone, unfortunately.
I mean, at least maybe partners. Come on, let's make this happen. Let's start a petition. You know, we do a lot of video editing. I love some Premiere. You know, we do a little Photoshop work. So
hey,
every dollar matters.
Friend and family. You're now friends and family. So just ping me and I can get you that significant discount.
There we go. Okay, so next question from Ryan, and I trying to make sure I understand this question. Correct me, Ryan, if I misinterpret. But there's a lot of Magento 1 code that made its way into Magento 2, and perhaps it's not necessarily following Magento 2's best practices, but the code works, and so a lot of that code has kind of been left due to lack of resources. And the question is, and I think it goes back to just adding more resources, but would Adobe be addressing this technical debt that thus far hasn't been addressed due to lack of resources?
Yeah, I can't, again, that's one that I can't answer other than point to historical precedent, new teams coming with the strong revenue potential that Magento has tend to get resources. But even besides that, like I said, I've got people on my team. If you want to point me to some of those issues that or some of those areas of the software that need particular care and loving from a developer with a little bit of spare time, I've got those developers with spare time right now that they would love to be working on it now. So the official answer is that's going to have to wait. The unofficial answer is I got developers if you can point me to what they need to be working on.
So I think out of this whole live stream, the thing to take back, Magento people, is Adobe has people. They got folks. They got time, right? Like, we got resources.
We've got thousands of engineers, and granted, not all of them are going to have the aptitude or interest of working on Magento, but I bet a lot of them would. And so this is a great opportunity for us, where there's this amazing product and project. The product we bought, the project you can't buy. You can't buy open source. You know this. And so it's something that I think I said on Twitter, that we now have bought the right to request an invitation to the community. And I think my sense so far, both from these questions and from my experience on Twitter over the last few days, is people are generally pretty welcoming and trusting, and saying, okay, what can you do for us, Adobe? And I think the answer is we can do a lot for the company, but I also think we can learn a lot from your community, and we desperately want to learn that. That was a big part of the reason that it's Magento and not somebody else. It's that value that we get from community.
And guys, keep your questions coming. We're getting down to the end of the questions I have, and Matt has already given up more time than he committed to, and I'm just going to let him go if you don't keep asking questions. So, Philip Jackson asked, "Does Adobe have an ethos around remote work? How is the culture able to incorporate Magento's heavily distributed worldwide team?"
So again, similar to the answer, or the question before, the answer before, we knew that it was PHP, we knew that it was open source, and we knew that the team was heavily distributed. So I don't think that any Magento employee is going to get an email on the day one after the deal closes saying, right, you've been living in Austin, we don't have an office in Austin, so you'll be moving to San Jose. We don't. I can't speak for the company on this, but I've never seen us do that with anyone. And the Magento employees would already know if they were going to have to move, because that would have been a condition of the deal. So I think we'll have a few more offices. We have a few offices like up in Seattle and other places that have come through acquisition. We have one in Boston from the Neolane acquisition, and those offices remain. So again, that's not an official answer, but I haven't seen. Adobe is a pretty kind and thoughtful and generous place to work. The people are good. We have been trying to centralize into a few offices, but we also have a lot of remote workers. A lot of people on my team are remote workers. Half my team, at least, is remote.
You did just pay $1.7 billion. You sure you're going to be able to keep the lights on at those individual offices?
As long as we don't give you free Creative Cloud, then.
So next question. Now that we've hammered it, see, I just ruined it. I almost had free Creative Cloud, and I just ruined it. Does Adobe, and this is from Ryan in the chat, does Adobe value feature development over bug fixes and making the platform solid before taking it further? I mean, that seems like a loaded question, but typically with Adobe's development, is it the main focus to make sure we have a solid working platform, or are we really focused on driving innovation?
Well, it's both. I will say there's been a huge emphasis over the past year on that, solidifying the platform, making sure everything works well together, kind of taking care of product quality. Speaking of the Experience Cloud in particular, with that response. But also if you look at our analytics product, the predictive analytics, the other things that they've released over the last year or so are kind of amazing. So there's been both, but there has been, I don't know if that's a loaded question because people feel like Magento needs to do some work on solidifying the platform or something. I don't know. But I can say from our standpoint, there's been a big emphasis recently on that cleaning up the code, making sure things work really well together. And frankly, I would view that as innovation, as enabling innovation. Maybe that's the right way to say it, because if the platform's crap, then it's hard to. If you're building on what did I read? I read this great description: building on favelas in an earthquake zone. A favela is kind of the slums in Brazil. But think if you build on the shaky foundation, it doesn't matter how cool the thing sits on top of it if it's likely going to break when the foundation breaks. So we've been putting a lot of investment recently into solidifying that foundation. But I mean, you look at the kind of things you could do in Photoshop and whatnot, there's clearly a big investment in innovation as well.
So does Magento, and again from Philip Jackson, does Adobe recognize a gap with the retirement of Business Catalyst, and do you see Magento filling that gap? E.g., is Magento a spiritual successor for Adobe's BC product?
I don't even know how. So that actually comes. I'm new enough at Adobe 4 years in that I don't have any concern for the spiritual legacy of Catalyst, but I don't know the answer to that question. I don't have a good answer for it, and But if I think it was Philip who asked that. If Philip will reach out to me on email, there are some folks who will be very familiar with Business Catalyst that can address that question. And you really have taken more. I thought we had this for an hour. I'm canceling stuff with.
We keep going till you tell us to stop. That's how we do this. In fairness, we typically go an hour to 2 hours depending on the guest. So I've got one more question here. Let's do one more. That's where we're at. So was part of the Adobe, from Ryan in the chat, was part of the Adobe acquisition of Magento part of an Adobe business strategy to be more competitive with companies like Salesforce?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and part of that is, there are two ways to answer that question. One is we needed a commerce solution because our customers wanted a commerce solution. If we're building out this holistic experience cloud, one key part of that experience cloud is commerce. But the other part of it is that community, and that's where I think Magento actually puts us ahead of anything else. That's why it wasn't just a matter of buying commerce; it was about buying Magento and buying that right to ask for permission to participate in the Magento community. I don't think, in terms of, I mean, you can go back and look at all the Gartner Magic Quadrants and Forrester Waves and whatnot. Adobe, in digital marketing and this experience cloud business, we're always way up into the right. So we've done well there. But the thing that the future is being built on open source. The future is being built on developers, and that's something that, frankly, we needed help with, and that's where Magento fits in, both for commerce as well as for that community.
And I think I missed one question in the chat. I want to make sure I get addressed. I'm sorry. Just last one. I'm sorry. This last one. I'm not trying to. I try not to miss a question. And this one was asked early on, and I missed it, and it's my fault. I apologize. But Robert asked, in particular, is there anything meaningful envisioned in this acquisition for small business owners, or is the focus strictly on the enterprise level opportunities Adobe sees in this package? Last question, we're out.
Okay. And I hate to answer the last question with in part, that's not a question that I can answer in detail right now because it'll have to wait for the close. But again, I would say we knew going in that even though Magento has had increasing success with large enterprises, it also has the majority of its revenue that I believe comes from the small to medium-sized enterprises. And so we made the acquisition knowing full well that was the case. I mentioned earlier that on the creative side, we're very comfortable and have a long history of working with small to medium-sized enterprises and individuals. So at a DNA level, as a company, we know how to do that kind of business. On the Experience Cloud side, it has been large enterprise focused, not exclusively, but it has tended to be. larger enterprise focused. But if I'm sitting in the Magento community, I would view this as much as an opportunity to help educate Adobe on how to work with those small to medium-sized enterprises. So is it likely that our existing, well, I'm not going to say that because now I'm starting to veer into speculation that I shouldn't. I would say that there is much that Magento, in this particular area, there's much that Magento will benefit from Adobe. I would guarantee that there'll be it'll be easier to do those larger deals with larger enterprises. But for Adobe, it's also an opportunity for us to learn better how to do business at that small to medium-sized enterprise level on the Experience Cloud side. So the learning is going to go both ways in this acquisition.
All right. Well, I appreciate everyone watching. Please, if you're watching this, hit the thumbs up button on this video. Really helps the channel out. Hit the subscribe button. The more influence we have on this channel, the better we can get people on here to answer your questions and to provide value to you. So help me help you. Thanks for watching. There will not be a live stream next week. I will be co-emceeing Meet Magento Netherlands next Friday. We will be back week after next with some changes to the live stream. I've got some new hardware ordered. We're going to try out some different things. So it's going to be really fun over the next month. Also, in the description of this video, there's a link to the eCommerceaholic. We're calling it the Insider Club. I'm just going to kind of rip that off completely from Future Commerce, but it's basically an email with all the GDPR goodies. You got to really want it to get on an email newsletter nowadays because you got to check all these boxes and double opt in, but YouTube doesn't do a great job of notifying you when we go live. And so if you're interested in maybe more content from us or knowing our schedule and what's going to happen with this live stream, please subscribe to that. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.